Welcome everyone to Dr. John Bedker's Leadership Podcast, the podcast focused on leadership. The episode will begin shortly. Thank you so much for tuning in. Enjoy the podcast.
Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Dr. John Bedker Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, John Bedker. Well, we want to talk about a really important day today in leadership for all of us. There's a lot to learn about what supposed leaders, elected leaders, have done these past several days. Okay, so let's talk about it. I'm going to use 3 different pieces to quote from. I'm going to do my best to paraphrase, but in some cases quote what they're saying. Important sources. First is a piece from a person by the name of Ezra Levin. Now, Ezra Levin is part of a very large national organization, powerful organization, certainly one worth listening to, and that is a group called Indivisible. I'll quote from a piece that Ezra Levin has contributed about the topic today. And secondly, we'll go to Politico. Kathleen Tully McManus. She is also a staff writer at Politico, and we'll talk about who these people are, these supposed leaders. And then I'll finish by talking about one in particular, Senator Tim Kaine, who wrote an opinion piece himself in the New York Times about why he voted to end the shutdown. And that's our topic, right? That's what we're going to talk about. Reopening the United States government. Long, lengthy process, not much happening, and then the last several days, movement. So we're going to talk about that in the context of leadership. As you know, and I'm sure the same is true for you, but I am absolutely passionate about leadership. I want to talk about leadership. I want us all to learn and share stories about leadership, real life people in real time, and how they have been exemplary or how they have not. And today, unfortunately, is the latter, how they have not. We're going to talk about some real, absolutely spot on failed leadership today. Oftentimes, we've talked about the Republican Party in the United States. Today, we're going to talk squarely, pointedly, about the Democratic Party. And again, I make this point, and I'll make it again, that this podcast is about leadership, not about politics. It is about leadership. So we don't have a brand loyalty, so to speak. If it's the Republicans that don't exercise good leadership, we'll point that out, and certainly we have. And conversely, if it's the Democrats that haven't exercised good leadership, and that's certainly what today is about, their lack of good leadership, we'll point that out. So again, emphasis, not political, talk about leadership. Let's start with the piece about Ezra Levin and Indivisible. What did they have to say? I'm going to quote just pieces from this article. It's much more lengthy. I certainly recommend it. But let's talk about what they have to say about this bill to reopen the U.S. government. Well, it starts like this. We didn't just get a, quote, bad deal. We got essentially nothing. The original Democratic demands were threefold. First, permanent extension of the ACA subsidies. Okay. Second, Medicaid funding restored. And third, no more blank checks for the Republicans about rescission, impoundment, and restrictions. The Democrats dropped the Medicaid funding demand immediately after making them. Then they stopped talking about rescission and impoundment. They dropped from permanent to multi-year to finally 1 year of the Affordable Care Act, that again is that ACA subsidy, this week. A 1-year extension of Schumer's offer. Now, Senator Schumer is the leader, Democratic leader, which would make him the minority leader in the United States Senate. That's actually the same demand, though, that the Republican said they'd offer you weeks back. But they couldn't even hold it there. They surrendered, even without getting that 1-year ACA extension. So of these three important, frankly critical demands, these leaders got nothing. So says Ezra Levin. Conveniently, none of the 8 Democratic senators who voted for this bill are up for re-election this year. So already we're starting to hear a little bit of a plan, a little bit of a strategy, maybe some choreography. Ezra Levin says that's by design. There's going to be a lot of well-deserved anger directed at those specific 8 Dems. But make no mistake, this vote was stage managed. Ergo my comment on choreography. The way this works is that a critical mass of Democrats, within the caucus decides they're going to surrender. They look at the number of votes they need to do it. That number, folks, is 8. And they agree on 8 Democrats who don't have to face voters anytime soon. That's why senators like Mark Warner, he's from Virginia, can vote against it, even though they were widely known to be drivers behind the surrender. This is not true of every Senate Democrat. There were people, many people, who fought fiercely and stood up, spoke out, do what we all know leadership is all about, which is to do the right thing, say no. People like Elizabeth Warren, Chris Murphy, Bernie Sanders, Chris Van Hollen, others strongly voiced their concerns against the bill. Okay, so let's talk about Senator Schumer here a little more directly. Did Schumer simply lack the leadership skills to prevent this bill from passing? Well, we don't really know, right? We can't sort of get inside his head. But we have to be factual. Stress that a lot. Factual. It is factually true that he and the rest of the leadership team failed to hold their fellow Democratic caucus members together. In fact, that critical number of 8 Democrats did, in fact, vote to reopen the government and achieve nothing after this lengthy shutdown, the longest in American history. So what do we think about this? Well, the Republican budget guarantees that healthcare premiums will continue to skyrocket. That's what's going to happen. This is what these folks agreed to. Rural hospitals will close. More people will go without health care. And more people will die. Some estimates are as high as 50,000 people per year with the legislation as it's proposed and as these 8 Democrats joined with Republicans may in fact happen. It does nothing to stop Trump from treating the federal budget as his personal piggy bank. Well, there are Democrats that are trying to declare this as a win. They did get an agreement from Republicans for a vote on the Affordable Care Act subsidies. This is the heart and soul of what Democrats were fighting for so many Americans, maybe 20 million Americans, who may very likely not be able to afford health care because they're going to be priced out of the market when these premiums skyrocket, which is what the intention is, to ensure that the poor, the needy, can find a way to subsidize the tax breaks for the very wealthy. That is the Republican legislation. Okay, so there is going to be a vote about 40 days from now. But, again, the Democrats are in the minority, right? Democrats control the House of Representatives, they control the U.S. Senate, and certainly the presidency in Donald Trump. And the reality, folks, the Democrats don't have the votes to win that consideration. Senate Democrats surrendered when they had maximum leverage and were winning as a minority, winning the fight. This surrender came weeks after the largest protest in American history and days after the best election night in a decade. The public opinion polling showed Democrats were winning the fight and that the party's own approval ratings were rising in response to them keeping up the fight. The fight for affordable health care that would affect tens of billions of Americans. Well, this is one of those rare times when the minority really is in a good place, a good leverage place, because the American people were behind them. The Republicans were on the ropes. Well, why do they cave in? Why did these 8 Democrats surrender? Well, there are a whole bunch of questions about that. I'll go into it a little bit. But I think it's clear that what we have to do is try to understand the role of leadership here. Did these people represent those that elected them, those that they serve, supposedly those that they lead, or did they succumb? You know, not to be overly simple, but it really is that simple. The leader's job is to lead. If you don't, you ought to be replaced. And there is that conversation going on now. Many people saying that the minority leader, Chuck Schumer, should in fact be replaced. Well, there's a lot to cover in that regard. Not enough time today to do that, but that is where the Democrats are. They caved in. They surrendered. They, in fact, got nothing. And now, what was promised, a vote on tax credits, is not only uphill, but mathematically impossible. There are 53 Republicans, 47 Democrats. So the vote on party line, you lose. So let's look at who these 8 Senate Democrats are who voted to end the shutdown. This comes from the piece by Kathleen Tully McManus of Politico. Okay, so there's a lot of discussion going on, but a few obvious threads that connect these groups. All right? Let's talk about that, who they are. First, Senator Catherine Cortez Masto. She's from Nevada. She's voted 15 times to end the federal government shutdown, even before Democrats had extracted the promise of a vote on the health care tax credits. She repeatedly stated she did not want to inflict sweeping pain on some Americans in order to extract a solution to the impending health care crisis of expiring tax credits. So basically, she said, rather than do the right thing, I'm going to do the expedient thing. Some people might be delayed at an airport. Not good. A national park might not be open. Not good. The list goes on and on. Some important, maybe some not so important, but there's a lengthy list of people that will be put out by the government shutdown, for sure. Let me be clear about that. But the idea that children, the aged, infirm, the mentally ill, people on Medicaid and Medicare would lose their care, leaving a child hungry, it just seems unconscionable. From a leadership point of view, if you said, is it the right thing to do? That answer, folks, is an emphatic no. Next, Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois. Democratic whip. So effectively, he's in leadership of the Democratic Party. And the only member of party leadership who voted with the Republicans to advance the deal to end the shutdown. Wow. He says this bill isn't perfect, but it takes important steps to reduce the shutdown hurt, he said in a statement. Now that Democrats secured these wins, he calls them wins, it's time for Leader Thune to keep his promise to schedule a vote on the ACA tax credits in December. Well, folks, we've talked about that. The majority in the Senate are Republicans, not Democrats. There's a long history of Republicans being against the Affordable Care Act. Next, Senator Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire. She also voted to end the shutdown. She said, I've heard from Granite Staters who can't afford a doubling of their health insurance costs. I've also heard from families about the deep pain that the government shutdown has caused. So she wants to straddle the fence, so to speak, ride both sides. I think it's bad that people would lose their health care. I think it's bad that people might be suffering otherwise. Wow. How do you figure out what the right thing is when you can't figure out what the right thing is? That's a little tough. And Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia. Now here's a person who represents about 150,000 federal workers. They are obviously affected by the shutdown deeply and back the deal that includes a key provision for his state. Reinstatement of federal workers impacted by the mass reduction in force firings during the shutdown. We'll talk more about him later, Senator Kaine. Angus King of Maine. He's an independent, caucuses with the Democrats. He was a key negotiator to strike a deal, to guarantee a vote on this Affordable Care Act tax credits. Senator Jackie Rosen, also of Nevada. Well, there's 95,000 Nevadans who utilize ACA tax credits. Wow, 95,000 people will be affected by her voting with the Republicans. By that I mean negatively affected. Jean Shaheen of New Hampshire, she was an original sponsor of the legislation that created the enhanced Obamacare tax credits that have been the center of the shutdown. She's retiring this year. So, in a sense, no backlash to her. Okay. That's just a very, very brief cameo of the people. So what happens? I said we spend a little time on Tim Kaine, and I'm going to finish talking about Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia. Did an opinion piece in the New York Times. Folks, this is a master class in doublespeak. Doublespeak at its very best. Which, to be clear, not a good quality for a leader. Not a good quality. He starts his article with, government shutdowns are awful. People get laid off, lose critical services. Citizens with questions about their tax refunds or Social Security benefits can't get answers. Air traffic grows chaotic and potentially even dangerous, and the economy suffers. It's the responsibility of the President and Congress to do everything they can to avoid shutdowns, or if we're in one, to get out quickly. That's why after 38 days of mounting economic pain, risk to America's safety, and no clear end in sight, I joined the bipartisan group initiated by Senators Jeanne Shaheen and Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire and Angus King of Maine, who had been working with Republicans to find a deal to end the latest government shutdown. I understand the earnest criticism from those who say that extending the shutdown, which began October 1, would have forced Republicans to offer more concessions to Democrats on critical issues such as health care, but I was at the negotiating table, and I believe the chances of that were near zero. All right, so they all want to spin. They want to turn the argument around. And what do we know centrally, pivotally about leadership? And that is that leadership is all about doing the right thing. I've talked about this before, but being deaf to expediency when principle is involved is a core leadership value. Be deaf to expediency when principle is involved. When we're saying to Medicaid and Medicare recipients, people that need these tax credits under the Affordable Care Act to continue to get health care, that they would be priced out of the market, they're talking about multiple increases in their premiums, which are already high because they have conditions. So, the idea of a person having it double, triple, or quadruple, these people said, let's not even put it on the table. Let's rescind that demand because we can reopen the government. Let's pick expediency over principle. Folks, never, never, ever, as a leader, do that. Be deaf to expediency where principle is involved. We must care for others. We particularly must care for those in need. Pricing people out of their health care when they are on the lowest end of the economic ladder is not the right thing. Thank you all. Please, please get this message, understand the message, care about this message, live the message. Be deaf to expediency where principle is involved. All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll talk soon.
Thank you for tuning in to Dr. John Bedker's Leadership Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please tell your friends, and, of course, please follow our podcast and subscribe. Thank you again for tuning in.